Bearing with me there, folks. We had a little bit of audio difficulty. Again, I'd like to welcome you to the sixth episode of Esoteric Science Roundtable. This is a live call-in show. Today's topic for November 13th is going to be America's hidden history. Many of you might be familiar from your history lessons from school with what is taught to us as far as the history of the United States and as far as what led to the founding of this great nation that we call America. I would like to touch upon some of the events behind the scenes that helped to mold and fashion the circumstances that led to the founding of this great nation. America's history extends much further back than is recognized by scientists and historians. The archaeologist, the anthropologist, and the historian of modern day fail to take into account the overwhelming evidence that points out three main things in particular. The first point I'd like to touch upon is that there were highly civilized societies and cultures inhabiting North and South America long before the so-called Ice Age, and from what is preserved in the symbolism of many of the world's religions and myths as the Great Flood. The second point I'd like to make, these cultures exchanged and interacted to a far greater degree than is generally accepted by the modern scholar or authority by virtue of a high capacity of technical achievement and prowess. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later in the show as far as what these folks actually did have as far as technological advances that they have in common with us today. The third point I'd like to make is that there are always cycles, seasons, and reasons for each new inception of culture and civilization. When the old, outmoded conditions that govern and dictate the basic guidelines and moral compass of every society prove ineffective and unable to offer the best possible situation and structure, a new rhythm is imposed. All this is ultimately dependent upon man's ability to grasp and implement divine law, to make it manifest and to establish essential divinity as a cornerstone upon which to construct, and with man's capacity to base his creation upon divine inspiration. Since many in the ancient world worked in accord with these cycles and seasons and were acquainted with them intimately, they were very aware of the reemergence and reestablishing of a civilization based on the highest moral precepts, a civilization where free will and enlightened activity and wisdom reigned supreme, unadulterated and unencumbered. They knew the time would come when the birth pangs of a new nation founded on these very ideals would resound across the world as the old world made way for the new. If one bothers to follow the thread of history, one will eventually reach some understanding of the ebb and flow, the descending and ascending cycles, and the energy and force that moves and conditions these cycles esoterically. There are definite indicators, and there's evidence as well of these motions and movements behind the scenes that have helped to bring forth this nation according to a grand and magnificent vision to those to whom it was entrusted. There are several writers in particular that have done a really good job chronicling some of these events that have taken place throughout history that have helped lead, again, to the founding of this nation that are either glazed over, obscured, or not well known for some reason. One guy in particular, Manly Palmer Hall, he was a philosopher essentially and also an esoteric scientist. He did a great job of making a case for the foreknowledge of the Western world by the ancients. Also, the books of David Hatcher Childress. He's more of a traveler, more of a, not really an archaeologist, but an explorer, an expeditionary type person, kind of a modern day Indiana Jones, if you will. And he's written a lot of good books that also substantiate these claims that there was a lot more going on back in the ancient days as far as travel, communication, and the technology that was available to these folks back then that enabled them to accomplish the great things that they accomplished, but again have been lost and obscured throughout time, largely due to the fact that we didn't have written language back then so much. We had symbolic language, a pictograph, what have you, but the written languages weren't really established back in these ancient days. there is quite a bit of evidence, and David Hester Childress does a good job of bringing this out as far as artifacts that we find, for instance, in the Grand Canyon, the mounds in the Midwest, evidence from the different languages of the world. We find common words that you can't really understand how they would have made it to all these different varying cultures that are so widely spread across our globe, but yet they still have some key words in common. And also the idea that some of the indigenous plants, some of the plants that were native to certain areas, were taken to other areas far across the globe that can't be explained by just a carrying of seed by the wind and some of the normal traditional ways that they would explain away something like that. That it seems as if someone had to physically take these plants and to take them to other places on the globe for the purpose of growing them for who knows what they were doing. But at any rate, there is evidence of the plants that were used from other places that were moved around by these ancient cultures as well. And some of the writings that we have from the Greeks, since again this is where language generally originated for us for our modern day through the Greeks and the Romans. When you read Plutarch in particular, his account of some of the sea voyages of the ancients, and that of the vast distances they were able to travel, even in this ancient day, they were able to cover quite a bit of ground and establish a bit more than is widely recognized. Excuse me. Some other characters in the history of America, just to touch upon briefly, that also seem to have had some insight into the ideology behind what our country does stand for today as far as liberty, equality. Sir Walter Raleigh would be one of those. And also John Paul Jones, who's considered the founder of the Navy. These gentlemen were involved with secret societies. They were involved behind the scenes in the political movements to help shape events that would eventually lead to the unfolding and the birth of this new nation. One of the main people that I can bring up in this instance is Sir Francis Bacon. He published, a book was published actually posthumously right after his death in 1627 that was called New Atlantis. And this book basically breaks down a utopian society and bases the ideals for the society kind of in the same way that people foresaw the American continent, that this would be an ideal place for this new Atlantis, so-called, to spring up and take place. Even the coins of the Bermuda Islands from 1616 bear the crest of Sir Francis Bacon. And if you think, it's kind of ironic that he would call his book The New Atlantis, and coincidental, if you want to term it a coincidence, that the island of Bermuda would use the seal of Bacon on their coins, considering that Bermuda is largely where a lot of people consider that the continent of Atlantis was before it sank. Bimini, Bermuda, and those chains of islands out there off the coast of Florida is widely considered to be where Atlantis once was. And so the fact that the author of New Atlantis had coins that had his seal on them from the early times of America, to me, is not quite very coincidental. I think there is a definite reasoning behind it. But secret societies have worked through all ages, throughout time, to bring forth their greatest qualities in man and to take advantage of the conditions, to work behind the scenes, to influence the climate or outcome of events. Now, keeping this in mind, many people are familiar with the secret societies that have helped to mold and shape events behind the scenes, and they're a little bit more familiar with, for instance, some of the more negative ones, which there very well are the negative secret societies as well that have tried to amass power and keep it just to the few, belonging to those who I normally term those that wish to enslave us, those that work behind the scenes. These very few people that have been able to amass and manipulate power behind the scenes for their own benefit, for their own material and selfish ends. And so one example of this would be the Bavarian Illuminati, which was started by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, that runs countercurrent to the ideals of America and is working to stall, and it worked eventually to infest itself into America. They were able to infest the already existing Masonic organizations with this organization and to kind of act as a leech upon Masonry and to infest and infiltrate through that means. And so a lot of people, by virtue of that, tend to think of all of Masonry as negative. And that is not the case by any means whatsoever. They do have their negative elements that have been able to, like I said, infiltrate in. But by and large, especially if you know Masons personally, then you know that they generally are people of high integrity, and that this kind of incident that took place back then, think about it, it took place in 1776. This is anti to what was being raised and born and created in America, in the United States. And so, again, you have an anti-movement to something positive, something that's for humanity, and then you've got this negative aspect over here that's cropping up to counter it, to keep us into the material nature, and to keep us away from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And another, going back even further, a very famous name as far as the discovery of America is Christopher Columbus. And we're taught in school mostly that Christopher Columbus was a poor Italian who had to beg Ferdinand and Isabella to finance his journey to allegedly uncharted lands to seek a shorter route to India. Now, this is likely not the case, and there's much evidence to counter that. One person in particular, Spiros Katouras, who is a Greek by descent, wrote a book called Christopher Columbus Was a Greek. And he claims the real name of Columbus was Prince Nikolaos Ypsilantis from the Greek island of Chios. And if you were to examine the signature of Christopher Columbus, you'll see it is composed of letters curiously arranged and combined with Kabbalistic designs that indicate his origin, intent, and allegiance to secret societies. And again, when you use the word Kabbalistic, that comes from Kabbalah, the Jewish mystic book. Another ancient writer, or early writer, that made reference to America was Nostradamus, the prophetic writer. He published in 1660. He specifically named America by name and also called it the land which keeps the Thursday. And that's an obvious reference to Thanksgiving, which is strictly an American holiday, the Thanksgiving Thursday. He also spoke of the trials and travails that America would have to go through, but he also spoke of its ultimate glory and crowning achievement when the cycle is consummated. And a lot of early settlers to the United States set up religious communities based on various philosophies. Some of those were the Pietists, led by Johannes Kelpius, who landed in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania seemed to be a hotbed for a lot of these early groups that had a bit of a radical religious ideology, that were seeking to have some freedom and some independence away from the established church in Europe, or established churches in Europe, I should say. And those would include groups like the Quakers, and you might be familiar with Benjamin Franklin being associated with the Quakers, and at least one Rosicrucian establishment, but the history of that particular organization is a bit obscured as well, but apparently there was a Rosicrucian organization established early on as well. And this would be like around the 1600s. There was a great book that was written by Manly Palmer Hall that's called The Secret Destiny of America. And it's a crucial book in my estimation, and it covers a lot of really important topics, and it's so much so that I'm going to have to actually borrow and read from some pages from the book. What I'd like to start with is a section in the book that refers to another book. It refers to a book by Robert Allen Campbell that was published in 1890. And the book was called Our Flag, or the Evolution of the Stars and Stripes. And it gives an interesting account of the origin of the flag's design and some of the folks that were involved with getting the flag design out there for us. So if you would allow me to read quickly from these pages. And this again comes from the book by Robert Allen Campbell that's quoted in this book. Chapter 2 of Our Flag is entitled The Colonial Flag. This, in substance, is what it says. In the fall of 1775, the Continental Congress, in session at Philadelphia, appointed Franklin, Lynch, and Harrison as a committee to consider and recommend a design for a colonial flag. General Washington was then in camp at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the committee went there to consult with him. While at Cambridge, the committee men were entertained by a patriotic and well-to-do citizen. At that time, the best room in this gentleman's residence was temporarily occupied by a peculiar older gentleman. As there was only one other guest room, Lynch and Harrison were given the unoccupied room, and Dr. Franklin shared the apartment with the old gentleman. Nothing is known about the mysterious old man except that he was referred to as a professor. His name is not preserved. He was beyond 70 years of age, but apparently in the prime of his life. He ate no flesh, fish, nor fowl, or any green things, and drank no liquor, wine, or ale. His diet consisted of cereals, well-ripened fruits, nuts, tea, and such sweets as honey and molasses. He was well-educated, highly cultured, of extensive as well as varied information, and very studious. He spent most of his time pondering over rare books and ancient manuscripts, which he seemed to be deciphering, translating, or rewriting. These he kept carefully locked in a heavy, iron-bound chest and never showed them to any person. He was liberal, but in no ways lavish with his money, but he was well supplied with all that he needed. The professor was a staunch advocate of democracy, and his favorite statement was, "We demand no more than our just due. We will accept and be satisfied with nothing less than we demand." And keeping in mind, though, technically we are a democratically elected republic. We're not a pure democracy, and that is yet to show its face on the planet in that form. On the eve of their arrival, December 13th, the committeemen dined with their host and hostess, also General Washington and the professor. The professor was introduced to the visitors without his name being given, and his ease, grace, and dignity during the introduction is especially noted. When Benjamin Franklin was presented, he stepped forward and extended his hand, which the professor heartily accepted. As their eyes met, there was an instantaneous, a very apparent, and a mutually gratified recognition. After dinner, Washington and the committeemen exchanged a few words in undertone, and then Franklin arose, saying, in substance, as the chairman of this committee, speaking for my associates, and with their consent, and with the approval of General Washington, I respectfully invite the professor to meet with the committee as one of its members, and we, each one, personally and urgently, request him to accept the responsibility and to give us, and the American colonies, the benefit of his presence and his counsel. After graciously accepting the invitation, the professor made his first recommendation. He pointed out that the committee now consisted of 6 persons, General Washington and the host being honorary members. 6 was not an auspicious number, and as none of the members could be spared, let the hostess be included so that the number could be increased to 7. This suggestion was unanimously accepted, and the hostess became the secretary of the committee. The committee met the following evening in the professor's room. General Washington opened the proceedings by asking Dr. Franklin for his recommendations. Franklin replied by requesting that the entire committee listen to the words of his new-found and abundantly honored friend, the professor, who had definite suggestions to make. After a preamble, the professor made the following extraordinary remarks. The sun of our political era, like the sun in the heavens, is very low on the horizon, just now approaching the winter solstice, which it will reach very soon. But as the sun rises from his grave in Capricorn, mounts towards his resurrection in Aries, and passes onward and upward to his glorious culmination in Cancer, so will our political sun rise and continue to increase in power, in light, and in glory, and the exalted sun of summer will not have gained his full strength of heat and power in the starry lion until our colonial sun will be, in its glorious exaltation, demanding a place in the governmental firmaments alongside of, coordinate with, and in no wise subordinate to, any other sun of any other nation upon earth. The professor went on to point out that the flag which he recommended would be subject to change in the future as the national destiny increased. This change, however, should not require a complete redesigning, but a process of gradual modification to make it announce and represent the new nation which is already gestating in the womb of time and which will come to birth, and that not prematurely, but fully developed and ready for the change into independent life, but before the sun and its next summer's strength ripens our next harvest. The design finally submitted consisted of a field of 13 alternate red and white stripes, and in the area which now contains the stars was the British Union Jack. The area containing the Union Jack was the one suitable for modification. The design was formally and unanimously accepted, and the flag was adopted by General Washington as the recognized standard of the colonial Army and Navy. There is no record of any report being made by this committee to Congress. And so that's one account that goes into a bit of detail in describing what actually transpired during the time that the flag was being designed. Now, this could be just a wives' tale. That's always possible. But I tend to think there's a little bit more to it. Tend to think there's a bit more substance to it, and that it actually was a historic occurrence. Now, there's also another account in this book that I'm going to read in a second that is very, very important, I feel, as well. That's equally questionable, but once you hear the words, I can't help but think that it has some validity, some substance to it, and that it has a ring of truth to it as well. If you're familiar with the situation with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, only one is known not to be a Mason. And during the Continental Congress, of the 55 members, all but 5 were Masons. And so this is something to take into consideration. Why were all of these people that were entrusted with forming this new nation, why were they all Masons? Why were they all members of a so-called secret society? Even though Masonry is not really a true secret society, you have to be indoctrinated into Masonry in order to receive information about Masonry. The reason being is because the symbolism in Masonry and the symbolism that a lot of the secret societies share, and they have shared, these groups work together. And they've worked together, as I've said previously, they work together for constructive purposes, towards goodwill and right human relations, and at other times they tend to work more towards disruptive aspects and trying to consolidate power into the hands of just a few and to try to get a monopoly on the power structure. And so you have these two opposing factions waging war at any given time. But again, the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were almost all Masons, and that is something to bear in mind. There's a definite reason for that, and there's a definite reason why we should think, why were these, the people that we really hold in high regard, that we really have much esteem for as our founding fathers, why were they affiliated with these organizations? What did it mean to them? Why was that so important in their lives? And as far as the account from the signing of the Declaration of Independence, this is another alleged account of what took place during that time. And if you'll allow me to read briefly. Some years ago, this is also again from Manly Palmer Hall's book, The Secret Destiny of America. And again, this is talking about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Some years ago, while visiting the Theosophical Colony at Ojai, California, A.P. Warrington, esoteric secretary of the Society, discussed with me a number of historical curiosities which led to examination of his rare old volume of early American political speeches of a date earlier than those preserved in the first volumes of the Congressional Record. He made particular mention of a speech made by an unknown man at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The particular book was not available at that moment, but Mr. Warrington offered to send me a copy of the speech, and he did, but unfortunately neglected to append the title or the date of the book. He went to India subsequently and died at the Theosophical headquarters at Adyar in Madras. Then in May 1938, the speech appeared in the Theosophist, official organ of the Society, published in Adyar. In all probability, the original book is now in the library of the Theosophical Society. There is no reason to doubt the accuracy and authenticity of Mr. Warrington's copy, but I am undertaking such investigation as is possible to discover the source of the speech. Well, Mr. Hall, unfortunately, has passed away as well, and so I don't really know to what degree he was able to determine the validity of this document or what further information he was able to discover about it. But he was able to do some research in his lifetime, and he states here, on July 4th, 1776, in the old State House in Philadelphia, a group of patriotic men were gathered for the solemn purpose of proclaiming the liberty of the American colonies. From the letters of Thomas Jefferson, which are preserved in the Library of Congress, I have been able to gather considerable data concerning this portentous session. In reconstructing the scene, it is well to remember that if the Revolutionary War failed, every man who had signed the parchment then lying on the table would be subject to the penalty of death for high treason. It should also be remembered that the delegates representing the various colonies were not entirely of one mind as to the policies which should dominate the new nation. There were several speeches. In the balcony, patriotic citizens crowded all available space and listened attentively to the proceedings. Jefferson expressed himself with great vigor, and John Adams of Boston spoke and with great strength. The Philadelphia printer, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, quiet and calm as usual, spoke his mind with well-chosen words. The delegates hovered between sympathy and uncertainty as the long hours of the summer day crept by, for life is sweet when there is danger of losing it. The lower doors were locked and a guard was posted to prevent interruptions. According to Jefferson, it was late in the afternoon before the delegates gathered their courage to the sticking point. The talk was about axes, scaffolds, and the gibbet, when suddenly a strong, bold voice sounded. "Gibbet! They may stretch our necks on all the gibbets in the land. They may turn every rock into a scaffold, every tree into a gallows, every home into a grave, and yet the words of that parchment can never die. They may pour our blood on 1,000 scaffolds, and yet from every drop that dies the axe, a new champion of freedom will spring into birth. The British king may blot out the stars of God from the sky, but he cannot blot out his words written on that parchment there. The works of God may perish, his words never. The words of this declaration will live in the world long after our bones are dust. To the mechanic in his workshop, they will speak hope. To the slave in the mines, freedom. But to the coward kings, these words will speak in tones of warning they cannot choose but hear. Sign that parchment. Sign if the next moment the gibbet's rope is about your neck. Sign if the next minute this hall rings with the clash of falling axes. Sign by all your hopes in life or death, as men, as husbands, as fathers, brothers, sign your names to the parchment or be accursed forever. Sign, and not only for yourselves, but for all ages. For that parchment will be the textbook of freedom, the Bible of the rights of man forever. Nay, do not start and whisper with surprise. It is truth, your own hearts witness it. God proclaims it. Look at the strange band of exiles and outcasts, suddenly transformed into a people, a handful of men, weak in arms, but mighty in godlike faith. Nay, look at your recent achievements, your Bunker Hill, your Lexington, and tell me, if you can, that God has not given America to be free. It is not given to our poor human intellect to climb to the skies and to pierce the counsel of the Almighty One. But methinks I stand among the awful clouds which veil the brightness of Jehovah's throne. Methinks I see the recording angel come trembling up to that throne and speak his dreaded message. Father, the old world is baptized in blood. Father, look with one glance of thine eternal eye, and behold evermore that terrible sight, man trodden beneath the oppressor's feet, nations lost in blood, murder, and superstition, walking hand in hand over the graves of the victims, and not a single voice of hope to man. He stands there, the angel, trembling with the record of human guilt. But hark, the voice of God speaks from out the awful cloud. Let there be light again. Tell my people, the poor and the oppressed, to go out from the old world, from oppression and blood, and build my altar in the new. As I live, my friends, I believe that to be his voice. Yes, were my soul trembling on the verge of eternity, were this hand freezing in death, were this voice choking in the last struggle, I would still, with the last impulse of that soul, with the last wave of that hand, with the last gasp of that voice, implore you to remember this truth. God has given America to be free. Yes, as I sank into the gloomy shadows of the grave, and with my last faint whisper, I would beg you to sign that parchment for the sake of those millions whose very breath is now hushed in intense expectation as they look up to you for the awful words, "You are free." The unknown speaker fell exhausted into his seat. The delegates, carried away by his enthusiasm, rushed forward. John Hancock scarcely had time to pen his bold signature before the quill was grasped by another. It was done. The delegates turned to express their gratitude to the unknown speaker for his eloquent words. He was not there. Who was this strange man who seemed to speak with a divine authority, whose solemn words gave courage to the doubters and sealed the destiny of the new nation? Unfortunately, no one knows. His name is not recorded. None of those present knew him, or if they did, no one acknowledged the acquaintance. How he had entered into the locked and guarded room is not told, nor is there any record of the manner of his departure. No one claimed to have seen him before, and there is no mention of him after this single episode. Only his imperishable speech bears witness to his presence. There are many interesting implications in his words. He speaks of the rights of man, although Thomas Paine's book by that name was not published until 13 years later. He mentions the all-seeing eye of God, which was afterwards to appear on the reverse of the Great Seal of the new nation. In all, there is much to indicate that the unknown speaker was one of the agents of the secret order, guarding and directing the destiny of America. Now again, this could be a fanciful wives' tale, but I really, to me personally, it really touches me and it really rings true to me that this likely did transpire in this manner, and that is one of the catalysts that helped to get this nation founded. Again, it could be all fallacy, it could be all just myth and wives' tale, but for me personally, it really does ring true, and it has a lot of significance to me personally. I did receive I did receive an email from someone recently that was asking me about the Great Seal, the one that we're so familiar with that's on the back of the dollar bill. And I would like to touch upon the significance of the seal a bit briefly. Originally, the bird that is the eagle that we've adopted as our mascot looked a lot more like a phoenix. And if you think again about the concept of Sir Francis Bacon, the new Atlantis, the rebirth of Atlantis, that is what our American continent supposedly represents, then it would be very adequate to use the symbol of the phoenix that arises from the ashes, that is reborn, that dies and is reborn. The seal was first used by the Department of State in 1782, and again I'm speaking about the symbol that has the triangle and has the all-seeing eye above it. It was not used, it first appeared on the dollar in 1935, and we all know that that was shortly after the inception of the Federal Reserve and the IRS. So as far as the symbolism goes, also e pluribus unum, out of many one, and novus ordo seclorum, new order of the ages. Okay, you have to look at this in a dual manner. You've got two factions here. You've got one faction that is truly seeking goodwill and right human relations among men, and is truly trying to bring forth a new nation, conceived in liberty, all of these things that we've heard before, that really wanted to bring this into manifestation in a real valid way to carry forth the visions of all these ancients that knew one day there was going to be this land, this great land that was going to carry forth ideas of goodwill and right human relations, and that would completely revolutionize all facets of human endeavor forever. Now again, the symbolism that is borrowed is mostly associated with Masonry, as far as the all-seeing eye, the pyramid, and what have you. Again, if you think about the pyramid, there's a broad base, but it gets narrow at the top. Well, there's also many people, if you look at that as a comparison of the average person, there's many people at the base that are not aware of what's going on at the top level. But the higher you get to the top, the closer you get to what's truly going on. You get from the unreal to the real. And in that sense, that great eye, that all-seeing eye, is the eye of God, is the will aspect of God, that is watching over and guiding. Also, but again, there's also the negative counter to that, which is that, that all-seeing eye and the pyramid and all that is actually the Illuminati, or those that wish to enslave us behind the scenes, that are running and moving world affairs. So I would say that since the seal was originally adopted by the Department of State in 1782, true that it was after the Bavarian Illuminati and after some of the infiltration into Masonry took place that the seal was initially used, but it wasn't used on the dollar bill. It wasn't used by the Federal Reserve, in other words, until 1935. And so again, with a lot of the esoteric symbolism, the symbolism is the same. It really boils down to motive. Again, I use the example of the Force from Star Wars episodes. The methods are always the same. It entirely breaks down to motive. What are you using this so-called force for? Are you using it, what is your motive? Are you using it for good, constructive purposes? Or are you using it for negative to divide people and for your own material satisfaction? And that is what needs to be determined. So I would say that since it was initially conceived early enough in our nation's history, when we still were a God-fearing nation, and we still, not to say that we aren't entirely now, but the patriotism and the fervor and the climate that was taking place when our nation was founded, I think we're yet to recapture and have a resurgence of that patriotism to the full that we could have. Some of the incidents that have taken place lately have kind of helped to bring that to the fore a bit, as far as people, being more patriotic and that sort of thing. But I think that's a bit transitory. For a real, true patriotic stance, I think that we're yet to see that. But I don't think that we have lost what our founding fathers have brought forth on this continent. I think we still have it, and I still think that we can exemplify the ideals that they initially conceived of when they were putting this land into effect, when they were bringing this nation into existence, when it was being born. let's see here. So again, keeping in mind the idea of rebirth, of renewal. The ancient world was centered and seated primarily in the West, and then after what was called the Great Flood or the Ice Age, then all the migratory movements were east, and they sprung up in the east, and then what we know of as the Western culture, the old world culture, European culture, eventually sprang up before the cycles swapped and made their way back to the West. And we have to keep in mind the idea of cycles and seasons, because things always have their time in the sun, and then they subside, and then something newer, more fitting and proper to whatever our evolutionary impulse is, comes into being, is manifested. And this, again, is divine law taking place. It always works in this way. And if mankind and man in general can grasp divine law and can help to implement it, then that it's that much better. And that is what a lot of these secret societies back in the early days, and from way back into antiquity, and I'm talking thousands of years here, were trying to eventually bring into public consciousness, bring into the man in the street's attention. And now that we are so intellectually inclined and such specialized beings these days, we definitely have the capacity to make use of this information that was out there for us a long time ago, but it's been largely obscured or glazed over. But mostly it's hiding in plain sight. It's just people just don't know to look for it. I think that is changing, though. Coming up very quickly here on 40 past the hour, and so if Chris, if you wouldn't mind putting up the phone number, I'd like to see if we can start taking some calls if the folks out there in the listening audience would like to get involved and kind of share their 2 cents worth on this subject of the secret history of America, or America's hidden history, and some of the things that have molded and shaped behind the scenes to help us establish this great country. And one thing about esoteric science that they do try to dissuade, that is generally not encouraged, is a sense of nationalistic pride. And I would say that, you know, it is definitely hard not to have somewhat of a sense of pride in your birthplace, in your country, what have you. But you could keep that in perspective and still consider yourself, you know, a citizen, a global citizen, and even more so, a universal citizen. And keep in scope, keep in perspective what it means to be an American, or whatever your nationality may be, what it means to be born in that country, and to have that as your native tongue, and the customs, characteristics, and qualities that come with being a member of any particular national distinction. All nations have their place in the sun, as I've said, and they all have their reasonings for existing. So, and that again is the way that God creates. There's always going to be a diversity. There's always going to be diversity there. And let's see if I can recap a bit here. Talk about some of these ideas. And again, as far as the country, the idea of America being around much longer than is generally accepted. There's a lot of instances, or a lot of evidence to support the fact that there was more travel going on back then than is well known today. And to take it really far back, if you follow the history of Atlantis to any degree, you might come across the concept or the idea that they had their own airships, their own flying airships that were called Phalanx. Just as the ancient Indians had their own flying ships, allegedly, they were called Vimana. And the person I mentioned earlier, David Hatcher Childress, he speaks a lot about these so-called flying ships from a mythological standpoint and from a technological and scientific aspect as well. And he tries to bring out some of the things, again, that have been obscured or glazed over previously. A lot of good evidence to show that perhaps indeed that these ships did actually exist. Now, granted, we don't have one intact that's preserved in some museum somewhere to fall back on as an example. But again, it seems as though all I firmly believe all myth is based on some fact. And as far as the idea of the advanced technological prowess and capacity of the ancients, I definitely tend to believe that we had much more capacity than is generally accepted by mainstream academia. And even when it comes to the idea of the pyramids, we still, with all of our modern science, cannot reconstruct a pyramid. Try as we may with trying to push these huge blocks, these multi-megaton, some hundreds of tons blocks, to try to push them and to get them at that kind of an incline that the ancients had to use in order to get them up to construct the pyramids. Again, we still can't do that. And so that should be an indicator to us that these folks had some kind of capacity back then. And there are a lot of people that tend to want to put all of the technological accomplishments of the ancients to blame it on some kind of alien intervention, that there were aliens intervening with our early races that gave us technology to be able to accomplish these great feats. I don't completely discount the idea that we have had some alien intervention, interaction, possibly interbreeding, what have you. There seems to be some evidence for that. But I do think that we as humans have a lot more inherent in us than is generally accepted. We have a much greater capacity to be able to carry out these things than is generally recognized. Human beings throughout history are very, very qualified individuals. We as a race, we've accomplished a lot, and our history, if this of what we see right now in the social landscape and the political landscape is any indicator, then we really are coming together. I know there's a lot of things that seem negative these days that we're overwhelmed by, and the images that we tend to get through the media tend to be all negative these days. But there is definitely, if you can look past all of this seeming chaos, there really is order emerging underneath it all. Now, again, what is this order? What is this chaos and order situation that's going on? Well, some people point their finger to what they want to call the New World Order. Now, I think it's abundantly clear to anybody that has two eyes that we already have a so-called New World Order, and that's really taken place since World War II in particular, that has implemented itself and established itself on a world basis, to where technology and different things have made it to where we're living in a global community these days. No man is an island unto himself, and no one nation can exist apart from the other nations. It would be like trying to have a heart exist on a table somewhere by itself without being incorporated into a physical body. It's just not, I mean, true, it can be done possibly through some scientific means, but as far as a naturally occurring situation, everything in the body has a function and it works cohesively together. When you separate an element from that, it ultimately dies and withers away. So we need to keep that in mind, that yes, there is a New World Order, and this is something I'd like to touch upon a bit too, as far as the future of what a New World Order may be and what it could be. Now, what it might be, as far as according to those that wish to enslave us, those that have been able to amass the power behind the scenes, as far as those people are concerned, their idea of a New World Order is limited mobility for the average person, limited rights, stamping out mostly any aspect of free will for the individual, and amassing the power among a very small amount of people, the highest levels, tucked away somewhere, again, either by virtue of their bloodline or some cabal, some secret pact that's been made some long time ago that has kept these factions behind the scenes but in power, because they've been able to capitalize on the wealth of individual nations. They've been able to take over the nation by use of their media, the press, and what have you. And so you definitely have a new world order emerging in this sense that has a more of a totalitarian slant, that seems to be the many working and activity of the many that goes to the benefit of just a very, very small number. Now, I do see that New World Order working itself out and being manifested right now on the planet as we speak, and it has been in effect for a long time. But again, the two opposing factions you have this apparent seeming that there's a new world order coming down the pike, and that all the negativity, all of the nice little, the executive orders that are tucked away, and all of the little protocol and programs that are sitting kind of dormant that can be enacted, or that may be enacted and we're unaware of it, to kind of compromise our lifestyles and to, again, limit our mobility, limit our freedom, limit our free will, limit our thinking, limit our free thinking, limit our free speech, and all of these things that we hold so dearly by virtue of being here in this country. So there is, again, these two opposing factions. Again, there's also secret societies behind the scenes that are working towards goodwill, towards right human relations, and towards seeing that man is put in his place of prominence as a co-creator with the divine so that we can move forward. Again, we have these two opposing factions. So secret societies, again, think about it like the Force. Secret societies are going to, on both sides, all camps are going to be using mostly the same methods. It's the motive, their thinking. What is their ideology, their thinking behind it? Why are they doing this? That's what really counts. What is the motive? Well, it looks as if I have a call here, so I'm going to go ahead and check with this person to see what's going on today. Hello, caller. Having some difficulty getting the caller on. Caller? I seem to have some difficulty getting the caller box to work. Apologize for that if you're holding. Hello, caller.
Yes.
Hi, sorry about that. How are you this evening?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Good, good.
Yeah, I had a question about the new world order you were talking about.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, will it be coming out of Pakistan, you think? Or does the Taliban, you think, have anything to do with this? Will they be bringing the new world order in?
No, they are low-level puppets, and if you watch some of the more astute political commentators on Access Television, they've got it a lot better. They can make a better presentation than I can. I'm just trying to bring out more of the esoteric or the spiritual aspects to all this. But those guys are low-level players. They're being manipulated far beyond the scenes by, again, those who I call those that wish to enslave us, a small group.
Even with them being in the mountains?
Well, think about the technology that we have to where the cameras that we have, the spy satellites, where you can see a freckle on a man's arm. I don't know if you've seen that video. There's footage that's been shown on Access where they zoom in, and this is like 20-year-old technology that they're talking about, where you can zoom in on a freckle on a man's arm that might be lying out sunning himself in a park somewhere. So, and the heat-seeking capacity that we have, the infrared and all these kind of things, I think it's very unlikely that any man can hide and be tucked away that long. Even the instance of the guy, the supposed abortion bomber, I think his name was Eric Randolph or something like that supposedly tucked himself away in North Carolina somewhere in the woods and is yet to be heard from, that supposedly he's living off the land possibly or something like that. I kind of even doubt that that's the case. It seems like if you want to be found, and that's the same for a Saddam Hussein as well, these guys are just puppets. They're propped up out there and kept in the closet until we need a boogeyman, then we bring them on out. And the Taliban, yes, there is some spiritual things going on behind the scenes because those people in Afghanistan needed to have their free will restored. They were being squelched and they were being compromised by the Taliban. And so regardless of how all this went down, it is ultimately a good thing that they were able to be freed from this oppressive regime. But again, all the Taliban people, I would say, and even on up to Osama bin Laden and much higher up than him, they're all operatives. And Alex Jones in particular goes into so much great detail as to who these guys are behind the scenes and what their affiliations are, as far as Osama bin Laden being a CIA asset, working hand in hand with the Bush family, things along those lines. So there is a lot going on behind the scenes, but the Taliban and all that, yes, they are making things happen. There's motion going on there, but that's such a small, minute little thing. Although they are able to use that to distract us here in the States. Whereas we could really be getting together, helping one another out, these distractions come up that sidetrack us. And that's a good example of how they're using this little so-called war to completely sidetrack us. In the same sense as in the Gulf War, they do the same
but
thing.
in the sense of them calling this a holy war, I mean, is that not going to bring apart the New World Order? I mean,
Well, there's been a New World Order. Think about 1945. Think about the end of World War II when all of the land in the world, not all the land, but a lot of land was restructured, borders changed, the rule of the land changed as far as the leadership and the governmental things. Russia got part of Eastern Europe. Japan got a little hunk of something, even though they were defeated. They all somehow were able to, because of their gains and losses, things were restructured. And that, to me, was the true New World Order. I mean, you can look at other instances throughout history, too, but that is the real, evident New World Order aspect, to me personally, that you can definitely put a finger on and say, 1945, the end of the Second World War, was really a benchmark for a New World Order as far as a restructuring on a global scale, and also the United Nations coming into more of a role as far as these international trials and things like that, and more of a global scenario coming into play. We really globalized after World War II.
is the mark of the beast upon us, you believe?
Well, that's definitely a very relative thing, because see, through esoteric science, I don't choose to take any religious book as a strictly literal document. There's always a symbolic side and there's always a literal side.
Right.
Now, if you understand the book of Revelations in particular, the individual that composed that book had some Kabbalah, some Kabbalistic, if you will, from the Jewish mysticism, had that influence, was in the writings. And you can see, when you read something about, let those who have understanding, things like that, that's always a key word, that's always a precursor, is like a little key thing to tell you, hey, here's something that's encrypted for you here, coming up. So pay special attention and look at the esoteric as opposed to the exoteric aspect of this writing. And so that number actually refers to a time cycle. The number of the beast, 666, that refers to a time cycle that's far in the future from now. And basically the mark of the beast basically boils down to the sin or the heresy of separation, that any one person is separate from any other person, any other being, any other plant, any other animal, that there is a unity that we all share in, that we're all, in our diversity in manifestation, we're all differentiated aspects of one creative impulse. We're all different aspects of God, if you will. And so when we choose to forget that, then we're just really causing problems. We're really making problems for ourselves by and going against the grain and making it hard for ourselves by not realizing these things.
So national ID cards shouldn't be a concern?
I'm very concerned about national ID cards, and I probably will get together with Chris Athanas, Jeff Contreras, and some of the other guys around here, if indeed it's looking like that's coming down the pike. Really, I think that we should pool our resources here at Access, because we're the guys that seem to be on top of it more so and trying to bring this information out to the public. So I'm in touch with at least some of those guys, and I'm really eager to get together with those guys and have a big forum to get people aware of these things, if indeed it gets to that point. But I definitely am not a fan of a national ID card. It's the same thing that the Nazis did before they rounded up the Jews. Same concept. Thank you for your call. Have a nice evening. Okay? Thank you. Take care. Hello, caller.
Yes, I was wondering if you knew if the CIA base was located underneath the UT campus.
I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. There's probably some other people in Austin that would probably have some better knowledge of that than myself. Thank you for your call. Have a nice evening.
Hello?
caller. Yes?
Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you had ever read a book called The Astrology of America's Destiny by Dane Rujar.
No, I haven't, but I have several books by Dane Rujar. Are you the same person that called about astrology recently?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for calling again. And thank you for watching the show. I just picked up a book because when you called in and you kind of clued me into, maybe I'm not giving the exact interpretation of this, that I need to probably educate myself a little bit better. And so I ended up picking up a book actually 2 weeks ago. In addition to the other Dane Rujar books that I have, I picked up one called The Sun is Also a Star. Mm-hmm. And Well, I have a handful of books by him. I also have the Astrology of Personality. At any rate, he to me is the authority as far as esoteric astrology.
Yeah.
Because, well, and also he was a member of what's called the Theosophical Society, which I have a tremendous amount of respect for the work that they were able to do as far as their ideas of a universal brotherhood and bringing forth the best qualities in man and women to collectively.
Well, you should really read that book because it talks about a lot of the things that you just talked about tonight. And
But see, again, think about this, though. That's the universal mind working because I've never read that book, but yet I'm espousing the same thing that he's saying. So, I mean, there's a higher coincidence in my estimation than that. And I do thank you, and I promise I will look for that. Yes, go ahead.
He makes a reference to the man that showed up at the Declaration of Independence and then
disappeared.
Really? Yeah, and I had always wanted to hear that speech, and I was so glad to hear it tonight.
Well, I'm going to try to put this. I'm going to try to put this show into circulation so it'll appear periodically in the future. So thank you for your call.
Well, now I have it on tape, and thank you very much.
Oh,
it was
no
a wonderful speech.
No problem at all. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Bye bye. Hello, caller. Hello, caller.
Hi there. You mentioned some positive and negative secret societies.
Yes, you're going to have to make this extremely brief because I only have a few seconds left, but go ahead.
Okay, what is your take on the Illuminati?
Well, again, there's different interpretations of Illuminati. There have been various societies all throughout history that have called themselves Illuminati, so we have to keep that firmly in mind. There is one in particular, though, that started in 1776 called the Illuminati, the Bavarian. Keep that in mind. The Bavarian started in Germany, Bavaria. The Bavarian Illuminati started by Adam Weishaupt. Adam Weishaupt in 1776 to counter what we're doing here. I have to let you go, but have a nice evening, and thank you for your call. I'd like to thank you folks out there for watching Esoteric Science Roundtable. Thanks, Chris, for commanding the helm of the Starship Esoterica. I'd like to thank Rick Fazette and the Thick and Muddy Gazette for hanging out. And you guys stay tuned for Chris Athanas and Reality Expander coming up next.